It began, as treason often does, not with a bomb, but with a whisper. A walk on a Tuesday afternoon, April 16, 1985. A gray, unremarkable man in a rumpled suit, carrying a plastic bag through Washington, D.C. He could have been anyone. A bureaucrat heading home, a mid-level manager on an errand. But he wasn't. He was Aldrich Ames, a 30-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency. And inside that plastic bag was a note, a simple offering. He was walking to the Soviet embassy to sell a secret. What he didn't know then, what no one could possibly have known, was that this single act wouldn't just be a betrayal. It would be an annihilation. He was about to hand the KGB the names of every single Russian spying for the United States that he knew of. He wasn't just opening a door for the enemy. He was setting his own house on fire and locking the doors from the outside. Aldrich Ames, known to his colleagues as Rick, was never destined to be a star.
He was a creature of the agency, born into its shadow. His father, Carlton Ames, was a CIA man himself, a hard-drinking analyst with a cynical view of the world. Rick grew up in a world of assumed names and quiet precautions. It was the family business. Yet, he seemed to absorb his father's resentments more than his tradecraft. He joined the CIA in 1962, more out of a sense of drift than duty. His personnel file quickly began to paint a picture not of a rising star, but of a chronic underperformer. Performance reviews were littered with words like procrastination, complacency, and a worrying lack of judgment. His postings from Ankara to New York City were marked by long liquid lunches, messy affairs, and a general air of listless mediocrity. He was average, and he knew it. Deep down, he carried a potent cocktail of entitlement and insecurity. He believed he was smarter than his bosses, more deserving than his peers, yet he was consistently passed over for promotions.
His personal life was just as frayed. A first marriage dissolved, leaving him with alimony payments that stretched his government salary thin. And then came Maria del Rosario Casas Dupuy. He met her at a diplomatic party in Mexico City, where he was posted. She was a cultural attaché for the Colombian embassy, and a paid CIA informant that Ames himself was handling. She was beautiful, intelligent, and accustomed to a lifestyle Rick Ames could not afford. They married in 1985. Suddenly, Ames wasn't just supporting himself. He was supporting Rosario's expensive tastes, her phone calls to family in Bogota that cost hundreds of dollars a month, and a mountain of debt that was growing into an avalanche. He was drowning. He sat at a desk in the CIA's Soviet/East European division, the very heart of the fight against the KGB. He had access to the agency's most sensitive files, and he needed $50,000, desperately. That was the number in his head, $50,000.
Just enough to clear his debts and breathe again. He rationalized it. He wouldn't sell out active operations. He would just provide some old, stale information. Names of a few Russians who had approached the CIA but were never recruited. Useless, he told himself. A bit of harmless house cleaning for a one-time payday. So on that April afternoon, with his life buckling under the weight of financial pressure and professional resentment, Rick Ames assembled his first offering. He typed a note asking for $50,000 in exchange for the identities of 3 Soviet sources. He put the note in a plastic bag, walked out of his office, and made his way to the Soviet embassy on 16th Street. He didn't have a clandestine meeting planned. He simply walked up to the Marine Guard and asked to speak with an official. It was the act of an amateur, a clumsy, desperate gamble. He handed over the envelope and walked away, his heart pounding, expecting to be arrested at any moment. But no one stopped him. The KGB was more than happy to accept an unsolicited gift from a ranking CIA officer. A few weeks later, a chalk mark appeared on a mailbox near his home, the signal to meet. At that meeting, his new KGB handler gave him a stack of cash, $50,000. It was that easy. The relief was intoxicating, but so was the power. The moment the money touched his hands, the lie he told himself, that this was a one-time deal, evaporated. He hadn't found a solution. He had found an addiction. Ames didn't just dip his toe into treason. He plunged in head first. The KGB wanted more, and he was more than happy to oblige. The initial drip of harmless information quickly became a fire hose. He wasn't just a mole, he was a walking, talking encyclopedia of the CIA's Soviet operations. His position gave him access to a staggering breadth of information: names, operational details, communication methods. He had the keys to the entire kingdom. And then, just 2 months after his first delivery, he did the unthinkable. The act that would forever define him, not just as a traitor, but as a killer. The CIA's roster of Soviet assets in 1985 was the stuff of legend. These were the crown jewels of American intelligence. Men like Adolf Tolkachev, an aviation engineer codenamed GT Cobalt, who delivered priceless blueprints of Soviet radar and missile technology. Men like Valery Martinov, a KGB officer in Washington codenamed GT Gentile, who revealed how the Soviets were bugging the US Embassy. These agents risked everything, believing in the protection of the United States. They were America's eyes and ears inside the Iron Curtain. On June 13, 1985, Aldrich Ames gathered the files on every single one of them. Every active Soviet agent of the CIA whose identity he knew. 10, 15, 20 names. He put them in a shopping bag, met his handler, and slid the bag across the table. For this, the KGB would eventually pay him millions. He didn't just sell secrets. He sold human lives. He liquidated the entire American intelligence network inside the Soviet Union in a single transaction. Back at Langley, a strange and terrifying silence began to fall. One by one, the CIA's lines of communication into the USSR went dead. Agents stopped showing up for meetings. Signals were missed. A vital asset who had spied for years was abruptly arrested on the street and hustled into a black car. Another was recalled to Moscow for a promotion and never heard from again. It was a catastrophe, a rout. Inside the agency's counterintelligence center, panic set in. This wasn't bad luck, this was a hemorrhage. An internal CIA task force, codenamed Anlace, was formed to find the source of the bleeding. The conclusion was unavoidable. There had to be a mole, a traitor, burrowed deep inside the CIA itself. The hunt was led by a team of dedicated, old-school investigators. People like Sandy Grimes and Jean Vertifoyle, two sharp, unassuming women who had spent their lives tracking the KGB. They began the painstaking work of poring over records, looking for any anomaly, any employee with access who might be the cause. And who was assigned to help them with this mole hunt? Rick Ames. He sat in the meetings, he reviewed the case files, He offered his own theories on who the traitor might be. He watched his colleagues desperately search for a ghost, knowing all along that the ghost was him. It was an act of breathtaking arrogance. As the years ticked by, the investigators grew more and more frustrated. They were certain a mole existed, but their own bureaucracy got in the way. The CIA was built on a culture of trust. The idea of turning its powerful analytical tools inward, of suspecting one of its own senior officers, was deeply resisted by management. They investigated phantom KGB bugs in their communication systems. They looked for breaches in other agencies. They looked everywhere except at the man down the hall who was starting to live far, far beyond his means. While his betrayed agents were being interrogated in the bowels of Moscow's Lubyanka prison, Rick Ames was cashing in. He paid over $500,000 in cash for a new house in Arlington, Virginia. He drove a new Jaguar to work. He bought $1,000 tailored suits and spent fortunes on wine and home renovations. His bank account, which should have held a mid-level government salary, swelled with unexplained cash deposits, over $1.5 million. All perfectly timed with his meetings with his Soviet handler. His colleagues noticed. They whispered. They joked about his rich in-laws. One officer even submitted a formal report questioning how Ames could afford his lavish lifestyle. But incredibly, the warnings were dismissed. Ames was seen as a poor performer, a drinker, maybe a bit of a slob, but not a traitor. He was protected by the one thing that should have exposed him, his own mediocrity. No one believed that Rick Ames, the burnout, could pull off a betrayal of this magnitude. For 9 years, the slaughter and the spending continued. The mole hunt stalled. Ames, feeling untouchable, grew sloppy. He left classified documents at home. He used his office computer to write messages to his handlers. He was a man walking a tightrope without a net, sustained only by greed and the institutional blindness of the agency he was destroying from within. But the investigators, led by Grimes and Vertefoy, were persistent. They finally began to focus not on tradecraft, but on something much simpler: money. They began to cross-reference the dates of the asset losses with the financial records of every employee with access. And slowly, out of a sea of data, one name began to glow like a radioactive: Aldrich Ames. By late 1993, the case had been quietly handed over to the FBI. The CIA could no longer be trusted to hunt its own. A joint team set up a secret headquarters across the street from Ames's office and began a full-scale, microscopic investigation. They bugged his home, his car, his computer. They tailed him everywhere he went. The final piece of the puzzle came from the trash. On 2 separate occasions, FBI agents performed a trash pull, secretly collecting the garbage left outside Ames's house. Inside, amidst coffee grounds and junk mail, they found what they were looking for: a torn-up ribbon from a word processor. When they painstakingly reassembled the fragments, they discovered a draft of a note intended for his Russian handlers, discussing his upcoming travel plans for a meeting in Bogota. It was the smoking gun. They had him. The decision was made to arrest him before he could leave for that meeting and potentially defect. On the morning of February 21, 1994, President's Day, Ames left his $500,000 house, planning to drive to Langley. As he approached his Jaguar, FBI agents emerged from all sides, cars blocking his path. There was no shootout, no dramatic chase. An agent simply walked up to him and said,
Rick, you're under arrest." Aldrich Ames, the most destructive traitor in CIA history, looked at them, a faint, almost bemused expression on his face, and said simply, "Okay." The game was over. The arrest of Rick Ames sent a seismic shockwave through the American intelligence community. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the duration, 9 years. He had operated right under their noses. In a windowless debriefing room, Ames began to talk. And he was not the remorseful patriot who made a mistake. He was cold, analytical, and utterly devoid of regret. He explained his motivations with chilling clarity. "They were paying me a lot of money." He saw the agents he betrayed not as people, but as abstractions, disposable pawns in a game where he had finally found a way to win. The final damage report was apocalyptic. He had compromised more than 100 intelligence operations. At least 10 of the agents he identified were confirmed to have been arrested and summarily executed by the KGB. Men like General Dmitry Polyakov, a high-ranking GRU officer who had spied for the US for over 20 years, providing intelligence so valuable it was said he single-handedly prevented a nuclear war. Ames sold him out. Polyakov was executed with a single shot to the back of the head. These men had names. They had families. And Aldrich Ames traded their lives for a nicer car. The fallout within the CIA was immense. Director James Woolsey was forced to resign. A deep, agonizing period of soul-searching began. How had the system failed so spectacularly? The investigation revealed a toxic culture of trust that verged on negligence, a personnel system that ignored repeated red flags, and a fundamental unwillingness to confront the possibility of betrayal from within. In the aftermath, security procedures were completely overhauled. Polygraphs became more frequent. Financial disclosures became more stringent. The agency was forced to learn a painful lesson. Its greatest threat didn't always come from Moscow, but sometimes from the desk down the hall. Aldrich Ames pleaded guilty to espionage to avoid the death penalty and ensure his wife, Rosario, received a more lenient sentence for her role as a co-conspirator. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He resides today at the United States Penitentiary, a high-security facility in Terre Haute, Indiana. His millions were forfeited. The Jaguar was repossessed. All he has left is a cell. The legacy of Aldrich Ames is not just one of treason. It is a cautionary tale written in blood. It reminds us that the complex machinery of national security is ultimately run by fallible human beings, driven by the same banal desires and weaknesses that drive us all: greed, pride, resentment. The story of Rick Ames proves that the most profound acts of betrayal don't require a master spy or a political fanatic. Sometimes, all it takes is a bitter man with a checkbook morality and access to a drawer full of secrets. He didn't believe in communism. He believed in cash. And for that, a generation of heroes paid the ultimate price. This file is now closed, but the archives are vast. To be the first to know when the next dossier is opened, subscribe to Federal Confidential and turn on notifications. In the comments below, let us know which secret story needs to be told next.